we're going to be discussing near drowning and some of its physical implications on the human body. We're going to first get into what drowning actually is, and more specifically near drowning. We're going to then go through some of the most common types of near drowning incidents in society today and really get down to what's happening at a physical level. So by the end of this video, you should hopefully have a better understanding of both what near drowning is and how it physically impacts the body. So first things first, what is drowning? Different people have different opinions on this, and they may tell you essentially different things, but the most widely accepted and general definition is some type of process that involves the experiencing of respiratory impairment from the submersion or immersion in a liquid. Overall, it's fairly general, as you can probably guess, and includes a huge number of possible circumstances that we see in everyday life. However, there is a slightly more specific subcategory of drowning, known as near drowning, and that's really what we're going to be more or less focusing on today. Near drowning is simply more precisely defined as the survival of such a drowning event for at least 24 hours after the initial incident occurred. While near drowning therefore excludes all events that lead to any type of immediate death, it can and usually does involve very serious complications. Now, before we can understand what's happening at a physical level during a near drowning incident, we have to know what specifically about it is causing harm to the body. One important thing to consider, though, once again, is that drowning is only a general description of a type of event. And by this I mean in the sense of how diverse the circumstances and therefore resulting medical repercussions can be. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to only concern ourselves with the most fundamental and prevalent causes of harm that occur during a near drowning occurrence, which are namely the type, temperature, and salinity of the fluid, and the associated type of blackout. Now, in any near drowning incident, the first impact the event has on the body revolves around the effects of the pulmonary aspirated fluid and its disturbance of the respiratory and circulatory systems. When the victim begins to inhale water in an almost reflexive attempt to obtain oxygen, water will immediately enter from the oropharynx into the larynx and areas of the lower respiratory tract, such as the trachea and the lungs. Now, upon entering the lungs, the first problem that we generally run into is pulmonary edema, which is just another way of saying a filling of the lungs with fluid, and what it results in is almost an immediate loss of surfactant. Now, surfactant is a type 2 pneumocyte secreted phospholipid, and what that means is not necessary to understand, at least in terms of what this video is attempting to do. But what you do have to understand is that the purpose of surfactant is mainly to reduce alveolar surface tension. Surfactant is almost like an inner coating of the alveoli of our lungs, and without it, the lungs very quickly and dangerously collapse. Alveolar function is given by Laplace's equation, where delta P is equal to transmural pressure, R is equal to alveolar radius, and gamma is equal to surface tension. So you should be able to see the equation. Now, according to his equation and law, pressure is inversely proportional to alveolar radius and directly proportional to surface tension. Therefore, when we damage our surfactant, thereby effectively increasing the surface tension in the alveoli, there's going to be a proportionate increase in the transmural pressure. And this is really why the lungs end up collapsing in situations like this, or why they pose the threat of collapsing in the first place. It's because of this increase in the transmural pressure. And this occurs in almost all incidents of near drowning where water inhalation is involved. But what comes next really depends on the type, temperature, and the salinity of the water involved, or fluid. Now, during incidents that involve freshwater sources, such as rivers, swimming pools, and bathtubs, just as examples, inhalation of the fresh water results in the solution portion of the water diffusing across the alveoli into the bloodstream. This through a process known as osmosis, which simply attempts to equalize pressure as fresh water is hypotonic to normal blood concentrations, and this is just a fancy way of saying lower concentration of solute to solvent. Now, when the water enters the bloodstream, the blood is effectively diluted, and the red blood cells begin to burst in a process that's known as hemolysis. Additionally, plasma levels of potassium increase because of these bursted red blood cells, while sodium levels simultaneously decrease because the blood ineffective circulation has been diluted, as as I mentioned prior. Now, these risk factors combine to put the victim at serious risk for electrical interference with the activity of the heart. In fact, in situations of this sort, ventricular fibrillation and cardiac arrest can often occur in as little as 2 to 3 minutes. Acute renal failure is also possible if the red blood cell detached hemoglobin is sufficiently in excess of what the kidneys can handle upon drowning. Now, in terms of temperature and that's effect on near drowning incidents, it's really only a major concern in incidents that involve fresh water. And this is mainly because in sources that involve fresh water, the water actually enters the bloodstream and poses the threat of hypothermia-induced cardiac arrest. This problem is still a concern in other sources of water like salt water. However, it's not as much of an immediate concern because the water doesn't actually enter the bloodstream, therefore taking much longer to achieve the same level of cooling. Now, during cases that involve saltwater sources, such as oceans or lakes as examples, the opposite essentially occurs to that in freshwater, in that the inhalation of the salt water results in the solution portion of the blood diffusing across the alveoli from the bloodstream into the lungs. This once again through the process of osmosis in an effort to essentially equalize the pressure, as salt water is hypertonic to normal blood concentrations, and this is just another way of saying it has a higher concentration of solute to solvent in comparison with blood. Now, when some of the solution portion of the blood leaves the bloodstream, the blood becomes more concentrated and the red blood cells begin to shrink in a process known as crenation. In addition to increasing the physical barrier preventing one from breathing, it results in a very thickened type of blood, essentially putting enormous strain on the circulatory system. This is demonstrated by Boyle's law, which states that pressure and volume are inversely related, basically. And the implications of this are that when the volume of the blood in circulation decreases, the pressure will consequently see a proportionate increase. The resulting stress from the increased pressure has the potential to be so great that the heart is unable to compensate for the increased workload, in which case symptoms of cardiac arrest can become apparent in about 8 to 10 minutes. Now, in any near drowning incident, the second most significant impact the event has on the body will revolve around the effects of the type of blackout that can occur. Now, while a blackout will always eventually occur if a victim is not tended to quick enough, there are two forms in which it's actually the cause of the incident in the first place. Now, the first type of this is known as a deep water blackout, and it results essentially from ascending in bodies of water 10 meters or greater in depth. During a deep water blackout, there's a loss of consciousness that's due to cerebral hypoxia, which is just another way of saying an insufficient amount of oxygen being supplied to the brain. And this only comes about when the victim is actually going back up to the surface, so that's important to keep in mind. The mechanism of action is essentially the result of a steep decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen within the lungs as one ascends large depths in short periods. Now, the first point to keep in mind with regards to this is that ambient pressure increases underwater in almost a linear rate with increasing depth. And so for every about 10 meters in seawater depth that you go, the ambient pressure increases by about 1 atmosphere. Now, one other point to keep in mind is Le Chatelier's principle, which essentially states that when a stress is brought to bear a system at equilibrium, the system will put very simply, react in the direction that serves to relieve that exact same stress. Now, in the context of what we're looking at today, this basically means that the effect of a change in volume of some gas is also to change the partial pressure of the molecules that make it up. So before the victim begins to swim back up to the surface of the water, the pressure is relatively high and the volume of the air within their lungs are small. This means that there's going to be a high overall pressure of air as well as a corresponding high partial pressure of the molecules which make it up, notably oxygen. But when the victim begins to rise and the pressure decreases and the volume of air within their lungs increase, this means that there's going to be a decrease in the pressure of the gas which makes up our lungs and a corresponding decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen. And it's this rapid drop in the partial pressure as one rises from lower depths to closer towards the surface that results in this sudden loss of consciousness. Now, the second type of blackout that we're going to be talking about is known as a shallow water blackout, and it results suddenly within shallow waters less than 5 meters. During a shallow water blackout, there is similarly a loss of consciousness due to cerebral hypoxia. However, the mechanism of action is quite different. The mechanism of action in this scenario is almost always the consequence of hyperventilation prior to submersion, which artificially alters our body's natural breathing mechanism. Carbon dioxide levels and their corresponding chemoreceptors essentially control our body's unconscious control over our urge to breathe. While hyperventilation has almost no increased effect on our oxygen uptake or saturation in the blood, what we're really doing is fooling our brain into believing that we have more oxygen and a lower demand for it than what we really do, thereby leading to sudden states of unconsciousness in situations where we're simply unaware that we need oxygen until it's too late. Now anyways, that's all we're going to get into today. Hopefully you'll now have a better understanding of both what near drowning is and how it physically impacts the body. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out some of the links in the description below for further reading on the topic.